Every morning, when you step out of bed, what is the first thing you do? Perhaps you reach for a bathrobe or slip your feet into slippers. You feel a slight shiver as the cool air hits your skin, and immediately you look for something to cover yourself. This is a ritual so mundane we never stop to ask, why? Out of the 8.7 million species sharing this planet, you are the only one who has to do this. A hunting dog is born with a sleek coat. A polar bear possesses layers of fat and fur so thick it can sleep soundly on a drifting iceberg. Even our closest cousins, chimpanzees, have a dense layer of black hair protecting them from thorns and insects in the jungle. Only you are naked. You were born with skin that is thin, sensitive, and completely incapable of withstanding the harsh elements of nature. Without scraps of fabric, wool, or processed animal hides, you would die of hypothermia in almost any place on this earth within a matter of hours. Biologists call us the naked ape. But behind that catchy name lies a massive biological paradox. Evolution is a process of retaining what is beneficial. So why did nature strip away our fur, only for us to spend the next several thousand years inventing an artificial coat to replace it? Clothing is often viewed as a symbol of fashion, culture, or vanity. But the truth is much darker and more existential. Clothing is humanity's first technology. It is the first artificial organ we attach to our bodies to survive. The moment we put on our first garment was the moment we declared to nature, this biological body is not enough. We no longer accept the rules of the animal kingdom. But exactly when did that happen? Clothing isn't like bone or stone tools. Fabric, leather, and linen decompose completely after just a few decades. They leave no fossils. For a long time, archaeologists were completely in the dark. Did we start wearing clothes 10,000 years ago? 50,000? Or further back? The answer finally arrived, but it didn't come from digging in ancient caves. It came from a place no one expected, the DNA of one of the smallest and most loathed parasites on the human body. If you want to know the greatest secret of human history, you have to look under a microscope. There, you will find a creature that has traveled with us since our earliest days on the savannah, the louse. But not all lice are the same. Humans are host to two distinct species, head lice, which live only on the scalp and hair, and body lice, which live in the creases of clothing and only cling to human skin to feed. This is the key. Body lice cannot exist without clothing. They need fibers to lay their eggs and hide. This leads to a simple but shocking logical deduction. The day body lice branched off from their head lice ancestors was the day humans began wearing clothes regularly enough to create a new habitat for a parasite. In 2010, geneticist David Reed and his colleagues at the University of Florida conducted a historic DNA experiment. They used the molecular clock method to measure the rate of genetic mutation between head lice and body lice. The results gave a specific number, 170,000 years. 170,000 years ago. That was the moment your ancestors, the early Homo sapiens, made a decision that changed the trajectory of life. This number is much larger than archaeologists previously guessed. It means that clothing existed long before we made our great migration out of Africa. But the 170,000 year mark also opens another existential gap. If we started wearing clothes then, what happened before? Other genetic studies show that humans lost their body hair about 1.2 million years ago. Stop for a moment and feel the weight of that number. It means your ancestors lived in a state of total nakedness for over a million years. A million years exposed to scorching sun, biting wind, and insects without any protection. Why did we lose our fur so early? And why, after successfully being naked for a million years, did we suddenly feel the need to cover ourselves? To understand this, we have to go back to the greatest revolution in biological history, the birth of the sweat gland. About 2 million years ago, a new human species appeared on the East African grasslands, Homo erectus. These were the first ancestors with long legs, slender bodies, and most importantly, a brain that was beginning to explode in size. The brain is an incredibly expensive organ. It accounts for 2% of body weight, but consumes 20% of its energy. And the brain has a deadly enemy, heat. When you exercise intensely, the brain heats up rapidly. Without a way to dissipate that heat, the massive human brain would cook under the harsh savanna sun. This was the moment evolution took its riskiest gamble. To protect the brain, we had to sacrifice the fur. Most mammals cool down by panting, like dogs. But humans developed a much more advanced cooling system, sweat glands across the entire skin surface. However, sweat can only evaporate effectively and cool the body if it isn't blocked by a thick layer of hair. We lost our fur to become the endurance runners of nature. While gazelles or leopards have to stop after a short sprint because they overheat, Homo erectus could persistently chase prey for hours in the midday sun. We weren't faster than them, but we were cooler. We traded our fur for the ability to control our temperature. But evolution always has a price. By losing our fur, our skin became fragile. We got sunburned. We were easily attacked by parasites. And most importantly, we became extremely sensitive to the cold of the night. For over 1 million years, our ancestors endured. Their skin turned dark to fight UV rays. They huddled by fires at night to stay warm. But their survival was strictly limited to the warm tropics. Until about 170,000 years ago, something changed. Perhaps it was a sudden climate shift, a mini ice age, or a volcanic eruption that blotted out the sun. Suddenly, enduring was no longer an option. Humans needed a technological solution. They needed a removable skin. Clothing originally may have been just crude animal hides wrapped around the body. But it wasn't just material, it was a shift in mindset. It was the moment we realized we could borrow the fur of other species to fix our own biological flaws. But simply draping a hide over one's shoulders wasn't enough to help us conquer the planet. To do that, we needed another leap, an ancient rivalry between human species over who was the better tailor. When Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, began moving out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they were not alone. There, they met cousins who were larger and stronger, the Neanderthals. Neanderthals had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They had muscular bodies, thick bones, and most importantly, they were perfectly adapted to the cold of the Ice Age. They had large noses to warm the air and better body fat than us. In theory, the Neanderthals should have won the survival race in the frozen north. But history chose us, and one of the most important reasons, ironically, lay in the needle and thread. Analysis of stone tools shows that Neanderthals also wore clothes, but their garments were rudimentary, usually animal hides with holes punched in them, tied together with leather thongs. This was draped clothing. It was loose, creating many gaps for cold air to whistle through. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens developed a revolutionary technology, the eyed bone needle. A sewing needle looks simple, but it allowed humans to perform a feat of thermodynamics. We began tailoring. We cut hides into different parts and sewed them together to fit the body snugly. We created sleeves, leggings, and sealed boots. The difference between a draped hide and a tailored suit is the difference between life and death. Fitted clothing creates a layer of trapped warm air between the fabric and the skin, keeping the body warm even in temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius. Tailored clothes gave us the flexibility to hunt and move much further. The Neanderthals, with their cold-adapted bodies, were overconfident in their biology. They wore clothes just to endure. Homo sapiens, with their frail tropical bodies, were forced to turn clothing into a mobile ecosystem. We didn't just wear clothes, we wore the African climate on our backs as we marched into frozen Siberia. The bone needle, dating back 50,000 years and found in the Denisova cave, was the true superweapon of humanity. It allowed us to turn a naked primate into a conqueror of dead lands. Sewing also required a profound shift in brain structure. You have to visualize the final product before cutting the leather. You have to calculate sizes. You have to divide labor. Who hunts? Who tans the leather? Who is the tailor? Clothing drove the birth of complex society and the language needed to exchange these sophisticated techniques. But as clothing became more fitted, it also began to do something else no one expected. It began to hide our animal nature. It began to create a new boundary, the boundary of shame and personal identity. And when we began to dye the first fibers pink and blue 30,000 years ago, clothing was no longer a survival tool. It had become a part of our soul. Imagine you are standing in a cold cave in Siberia 50,000 years ago. Around you are the sounds of stone striking stone, the smell of wood smoke, and the chill of the ice age creeping through every crack. Amidst those crude stone tools, there is an object that is small, slender, and impossibly polished. It is a bone sewing needle. This needle is only about 7 centimeters long, but it possesses a needle eye so exquisitely drilled that even modern craftsmen are stunned. It wasn't crafted by your direct ancestors, but by a mysterious, extinct human species, the Denisovans. The existence of this needle is proof that our ancestors and our cousins had entered a revolution of thought. A sewing needle is not just a tool. It was the supercomputer of the Stone Age. It allowed humans to take a leap in geometry and design. To use a needle, your brain must perform an incredibly complex abstract thinking process. You have to imagine how a flat hide will wrap around a three-dimensional body. You have to calculate folds, seams, and the elasticity of the material. Sewing was humanity's first exercise in engineering and architecture. But more importantly, sewing drove a change in social structure. An exquisitely tailored suit requires dozens, even hundreds of hours of labor. This led to specialized division of labor. Some focused on hunting for hides, others on tanning leather with animal fats, and the first designers dedicated themselves to sewing. The dependence on the needle was so great that if a tribe lost this tool during a migration into the Arctic, it could be a death sentence for the entire group. Tailored clothing turned us into assembled creatures. We no longer evolved by changing our bodies. We evolved by changing the artificial skin outside. But once we had mastered temperature, our ancestors began doing something else, something that no other animal had ever thought of. They began to decorate their survival. At Dudzuana Cave in Georgia, archaeologists found something that overturned all notions of prehistoric people: dyed flax fibers dating back 30,000 years. These weren't crude ropes. These were fabric fibers dyed pink, black, and turquoise. In the darkness of the Ice Age, amidst a brutal fight for survival against saber-toothed tigers and blizzards, your ancestors took the time to find minerals and plants to color their clothes. Why? Why would you dye a shirt whose only purpose is to keep you warm? The answer is because clothing had become humanity's first form of communication. The moment we dyed a fiber, clothing shifted from a survival tool to a symbolic language. In a natural world full of danger, the clothes on your body were your calling card. They told strangers which tribe you belonged to, what status you held, and how much power you possessed. The pink or blue on your linen shirt was a message to the world. I am not just an animal trying not to starve. I have culture, I have identity, and I have power. This was the start of fashion, not in the vain sense we understand today, but as a tool of social survival. It helped humans identify allies and enemies from a distance. It strengthened group trust and created a sense of belonging. Clothing allowed us to build massive social networks that far exceeded the scale of a small family. We no longer looked only at each other's faces for recognition, we looked at the shell each person chose to inhabit. But as clothing became a symbol of identity, it also began to weave darker stories of love, death, and social hierarchy. To see the true power of clothing in defining humanity, we must go to the Sungir site in Russia. Here, they found the graves of a man and two children who lived about 30,000 years ago. When archaeologists brushed away the dust of time, they discovered a stunning sight. The skeletons were covered in thousands of tiny ivory beads. On the clothing of each child, there were over 5,000 ivory beads, meticulously drilled and sewn. Researchers estimate that to craft that number of beads, someone had to spend 10,000 hours of painstaking labor. This means that 30,000 years ago, there were fathers and mothers willing to spend years of their lives just to decorate the burial clothes of their deceased children. The clothing at Sungir was no longer just about warmth. It was a song of love and grief written in ivory. It showed that humans had begun to weave spiritual values onto material substances, but Sungir also revealed another dark truth: inequality. While these children were buried with thousands of beads, other graves nearby were completely empty. Clothing had become the first tool of social stratification. It created a distinction between the privileged and the laborer. And it was at this moment that a strange psychological transformation occurred in the human brain: the birth of shame. Once everyone in the tribe was wearing clothes, nakedness suddenly became a sign of abnormality, of vulnerability, or of punishment. We are the only species in the world that feels ashamed of our biological bodies. Shame is not a natural instinct, it is a product of technology. The moment we put on clothes to protect our thin skin, we also began to build psychological walls. We began to view our bodies as something that needed to be hidden, managed. Clothing created a boundary between the inner self and the outer world. We were no longer free apes running on the savannah. We had become creatures imprisoned in the very hides and fibers we created. We had become artificial primates. Look at yourself in the mirror tomorrow morning as you are tying a tie or buttoning a shirt. Do you see the stranger standing there? 1,000,000 years ago, your ancestors traded fur for the ability to run long distances to fuel a massive brain. 170,000 years ago, they were forced to borrow the fur of other species to survive snowstorms. And 50,000 years ago, they used sewing needles to tailor their own identities. Clothing isn't just something you wear. It is evidence of a grand betrayal against nature. We are the only species on the planet that cannot exist without technology. If we stripped away all clothing from humanity right now, 8 billion people would fall into a survival crisis worse than any pandemic. We have turned ourselves into the first cyborgs. Yet, Although we don't have robotic arms or electronic eyes, clothing is the first artificial organ we attach to our bodies. We have detached ourselves from the slow process of biological evolution and entered the hyperspeed of technological evolution. Today, we wear spacesuits to step into the void, wetsuits to go to the bottom of the ocean, and smart fabrics that can measure our heart rate and connect to the internet. Our second skin is becoming more powerful, turning us into entities that can live anywhere in the universe. But the price for that power is fragility. We have become so dependent on these scraps of fabric that we've forgotten the feeling of wind on bare skin, forgotten the rawest connection to the earth. Perhaps the answer to the question, when did we stop being animals? Evo isn't a specific day in history. It was a long process that began the moment a body louse first laid its eggs in the crease of an animal hide. We stopped being animals the day we felt a shiver, and instead of growing more hair, we decided to find a sewing needle. We stopped being animals the day we saw nakedness as something shameful instead of a freedom. We are the naked apes who wove our own destiny. We are the world's first artificial creatures, those who used a dyed flax fiber to pull ourselves out of the animal kingdom and into an unknown future. And perhaps that is the beauty and the deepest sorrow of being human. We are the only ones on earth who know how to wear love, status, and fear, only to realize that beneath all those layers of fabric, we are still just fragile beings searching for warmth in a vast universe.